Miss Roosevelt, I'm calling because there's a matter regarding your marriage registration. We've been conducting due diligence on a property dispute involving your husband. We cannot locate any legal record of your marriage to Lukas Vane. I wanted to reach you before this becomes public, as the news will likely circulate quickly. What do you mean, no records? I have been looking through these files all morning, and I am certain that the information should be right here. I mean, there is no certificate, no registration, no legal marriage. The officiant who presided at your ceremony, one Raymond Osepe, he had his license revoked 18 months before your wedding. The documents you signed were never submitted to the registry. Miss Roosevelt, legally speaking, you were never married.
Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the last 7 years of your life were built entirely on a document that never existed. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate, cold, calculated forgery. You went to sleep a wife. You woke up a stranger. And the man sleeping next to you, the man who looked you in the eyes at the altar, who held your hands and repeated vows and smiled for photographs, he knew. He knew the whole time. This is not a movie. This is not a drama series. This is the true story of Rosevelt Calloway. And if you think you know how this story ends, I promise you, you do not. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something about Rosevelt Calloway. She was not naive. She was not reckless. She was not the kind of woman who fell for smooth talk and empty promises. Rosevelt was sharp, disciplined, and self-made in the truest sense of that word. She had built something real from nothing, from literally nothing, at a time when the world had given her every reason to give up. She had survived things that would have broken most people before she was even 20 years old. So, when I tell you that a man deceived her for 7 years, I don't want you to ask yourself, how did she fall for it? I want you to ask yourself something far more important. What kind of man invests 7 years of his life in a lie so deep, so detailed, and so deliberate that even a woman as intelligent as Rosevelt couldn't see through it? Because that is the real question at the center of this story. And it gets deeper. Because the day Rosevelt Calloway discovered that her marriage was a legal fiction, that her certificate was a forgery, that she had never been anyone's wife in the eyes of the law, was the exact same day she found out that her father, the man she had spent her entire life wondering about, the ghost at the edge of every birthday she ever had alone in a group home, was not just alive. He had been one of the wealthiest men in the entire state. And he had died without ever finding the courage to come back for her. And then, as if the universe had decided to compress every major life event into a single 24-hour window, a man named Adrian Mercer walked through a glass door on the 43rd floor of a downtown skyscraper, looked at her across a conference table, and said 4 words that changed everything again. But we will get there. First, you need to understand where Rosevelt Calloway started, because the beginning of this story is just as extraordinary as the end. Rosevelt Calloway was born in the spring, in a mid-sized city in the American South, to a mother whose name she would not learn until she was 19 years old, and a father who, for the first 17 years of her life, she believed simply did not exist. She was placed in foster care before she was 18 months old, and from that point forward, her childhood became a series of addresses, a series of rooms, a series of adults who signed papers that said they would take care of her and then, in most cases, found reasons why they couldn't, or wouldn't, or simply stopped trying. By the time Rosevelt was 8 years old, she had lived in 6 different homes. By the time she was 12, that number had climbed to 9. She was not a difficult child. She was not a troubled child. She was quiet, observant, and almost unsettlingly self-contained for her age, which is what happens when you grow up learning that the adults in the room cannot always be counted on to stay. The home that finally held her, if you can call it that, was Sycamore House, a group residence for older children in foster care, the kind of place that exists because the system has run out of other options. It sat on the edge of a neighborhood that the city had half forgotten, in a building that was always too cold in winter and too hot in summer and smelled of industrial cleaning products that never quite masked what was underneath. Rosevelt arrived at Sycamore House at 13, and she stayed there until she aged out of the system at 18. Those 5 years shaped everything that came after. Not because Sycamore House was cruel, though it had its moments, but because it was the place where Rosevelt Calloway decided, with the particular quiet ferocity that would define the rest of her life, that she was going to be more than what the world had decided to give her. She read constantly. She borrowed books from the school library and kept them long past their due dates, returning them only when the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Patrice Dunbar, would hunt her down in the hallway and demand them back with a smile that made the hunting feel like affection. Mrs. Dunbar was the first adult in Roosevelt's life who seemed genuinely interested in what was happening inside her head, and Roosevelt, who was starved for exactly that kind of attention, absorbed every conversation they had like water into dry ground. It was Mrs. Dunbar who first told her she should consider architecture, who first pointed to the little sketches Roosevelt was always making in the margins of her notebooks, building facades, room layouts, imagined floor plans of spaces she had never been in but somehow already knew how to design, and said out loud what Roosevelt had been afraid to think privately, that she was talented, that it was real, that it mattered. She was 15 when she met Lukas Calloway. He was 16, the son of a man who owned a small but successful contracting business, and he moved through the hallways of their high school with the easy confidence of someone who had never once had to wonder where he was sleeping that night. He was handsome in the uncomplicated way that teenage boys are sometimes handsome: bright eyes, an easy laugh, the kind of smile that made people feel immediately at ease. He sat down next to Roosevelt in a biology class in October of her sophomore year and leaned over to look at the margin of her notebook, where she had been sketching a redesign of the school cafeteria during the lecture. He did not ask permission. He just looked. And then he said, with the certainty of someone twice his age, "I didn't know you could do that." And Roosevelt, who had spent her entire life being invisible in rooms, who had mastered the art of taking up as little space as possible, who had learned that the safest thing you could do was to need nothing from anyone, Roosevelt looked at this boy who had simply sat down next to her and noticed her without being asked, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen. That is a dangerous thing to feel when you have been invisible your whole life. Not because the feeling is wrong, but because the hunger it comes from is so deep, so old, and so powerful that it can make you hold on to the person who fed it long after you should have let them go. They became inseparable in the way that teenagers sometimes become inseparable, completely, overwhelmingly, with a totality that crowds out everything else. Lukas took her to his family's dinners. His mother, a warm woman named Shirley, would heap food onto Roosevelt's plate and say nothing about the fact that she ate as if she was not sure when the next meal was coming, because Shirley Calloway was a woman who understood things without having to be told them. His father, Gerald, taught her how to read a blueprint, and Roosevelt, who had never belonged to anyone or anything, began to belong to this family. She began to believe, for the first time in her life, that permanence was something she was allowed to have. She graduated near the top of her class. She won a partial scholarship to study architecture at a state university 2 hours from home. The night before she left for college, Lukas sat with her on the front steps of Sycamore House. She was one of the last residents there, the building almost empty by then, and he told her that he was going to be there when she got back, that he was going to build his father's business into something, that they were going to have a real life together. Roosevelt listened to him, and she felt, underneath the excitement of leaving, a thin wire of worry that she could not name, a sense that what he was describing was a picture she was supposed to want, handed to her by someone who had decided, without asking, what her future should look like. But she pushed that feeling down. She was 18. She loved him. And love, when you have had so little of it, can feel like something you should never question. She came back. Of course she came back. She had spent 4 years building something extraordinary, a degree, a portfolio, a reputation among her professors as one of the most instinctively gifted students the department had produced in years. She had job offers. She had opportunities in larger cities. She had professors telling her she should think bigger, aim higher, move somewhere with a skyline worth designing for. But Lukas was here, and the Calloway family was here. And somewhere underneath all her achievement, Rosevelt Calloway was still the 13-year-old girl who had arrived at Sycamore House with one bag and a library book she was 2 weeks overdue on, and who had spent every day since then trying to earn her way into a permanence she had never been given for free. So she came back, and Lukas was waiting. And 6 months after she returned, he proposed. The ring was modest, a thin gold band with a small round stone that caught the light when she moved her hand. He got down on one knee in the parking lot of the diner where they had eaten their first meal together as a couple, not a restaurant, not a scenic overlook, not anywhere particularly romantic. A parking lot. And Rosevelt would later say that even in that moment, some part of her registered that he had not thought very hard about where to do this. That the setting said something about how much effort he was willing to put in. But she said yes. She said yes because she loved him and because she wanted this, and because wanting something desperately enough can temporarily blind you to the details that should give you pause. The wedding was small and simple. 23 guests. A ceremony held in the banquet room of a local hotel that had seen better days. Lukas handled all the paperwork, he said, because he wanted to take care of it. He wanted to give her that. He knew how much she had always handled everything herself, and he wanted her to just show up and be the bride. Let him take care of the logistics. Let him handle the license, the officiant, the filing. Rosevelt, who had spent her entire adult life handling every single thing herself, found this offer so disarmingly tender that she accepted it without a second thought. That was the moment. That simple, generous-seeming offer. That was where everything began to unravel, even though neither of them, or at least one of them, understood it yet. The officiant was a man named Raymond Osei. He was charming and well-spoken and performed the ceremony beautifully. He had a certificate on the wall of his small office that said he was licensed to perform marriages in the state. He was not. That certificate was as fabricated as the one he handed Rosevelt at the end of the ceremony. A beautifully printed document, embossed, framed within the week, hung on the wall of their apartment above the small television in the living room. Rosevelt would look at it every single day for the next 7 years. She would point it out to guests. She would photograph it and post it when their anniversary came around. She would, on a night when she and Lukas argued about something small and forgettable, stand in front of it in the dark after he had gone to sleep and remind herself that this was real, that she was someone's wife, that she had a family that the law recognized. Except the law recognized nothing, because the law had never been asked. The first years were not unhappy. That is an important thing to say, and it is a complicated thing to say, and it is true. Rosevelt launched a small architecture practice out of a converted spare bedroom. She worked 18-hour days. She took on clients that larger firms had passed on, small residential projects, modest renovations, the kind of work that does not make headlines but that builds a reputation over time if you do it well, which Rosevelt did, always, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing things halfway. Lukas took over a section of his father's contracting business, and by most external measures it appeared to be going well. They bought a house. They adopted a dog, a large and deeply uncoordinated golden retriever named Chester, who destroyed 2 rugs and 1 load-bearing bookshelf within his first year with them. They had friends over for dinner. They argued about money and household chores, and whose turn it was to take Chester to the vet, the same arguments that inhabit every marriage that is trying to function under the weight of 2 full-time careers and 1 excessively energetic dog. But underneath the surface of their daily life, the architecture of a problem was taking shape. Lukas had a talent for beginning things and a deep and consistent inability to finish them. A business venture would launch with real momentum and then quietly stall. An investment would be made and then quietly lost. Explanations would be offered, the market, the timing, a partner who had not come through, circumstances outside his control, and Rosevelt, who loved him, would accept these explanations, at least at first. But Rosevelt was an architect. She spent her professional life understanding how structures held together and what happened when they did not. She could read the stress points in a building the way most people read a room. And somewhere around the 3rd year of their marriage, she began to notice that the explanations Lukas offered for the recurring pattern of his failures were themselves structurally unsound. They didn't hold the weight he was asking them to hold. The timelines didn't align. The details contradicted each other in small ways that should not have been possible if they were true. She said nothing. That is the part of this story that she has returned to most often in the years since, the part that carries the most complicated weight. She said nothing because she did not want to be the woman who did not trust her husband. She had watched enough relationships fracture under the pressure of suspicion to know that doubt, once voiced, tends to find the crack it was looking for. And there was something else, something older and harder to name. Rosevelt had spent her childhood being the person who needed things, who needed homes, who needed stability, who needed people to stay. She was determined, in her adult life, not to be the person who pushed people away by demanding too much reassurance. So, She held her questions inside. She worked harder. She took on bigger projects. She won a city contract that put her firm on the map of serious architectural practices in the region. And she told herself that whatever was wrong with Lukas was temporary, that it would pass, that she had built enough for both of them to stand on. Before we go any deeper into this story, I want to pause and ask you something. If you're watching this from home, if this story is already getting under your skin the way I suspect it is, please take a moment right now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would genuinely love to hear from you, whether you're watching from Atlanta or Amsterdam, from Lagos or Los Angeles, from a living room or a parking lot or the break room at work. Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is far from over. And what comes next is the part that will stay with you. It was a routine document request that broke everything open. Rosevelt's firm had been shortlisted for a significant commercial development project, the kind of project that would have doubled her company's size and reputation overnight. The lead contractor on the project required a standard set of documents from all prospective partners, including personal identification for principals, tax records for the past 3 years, and in the case of married principals, a copy of the marriage certificate to verify the legal structure of jointly held assets. Rosevelt went to the file where she kept their important documents and retrieved the framed certificate from the wall, as she had done before, as she had handed it to banks and insurance companies and legal offices on various occasions. She unframed it. She made a high-resolution scan. She uploaded it to the contractor's secure portal. And 2 days later, she received a call. The woman on the phone introduced herself as a paralegal at the contracting company's legal department. Her name was Sandra Obi. Her voice was measured and professional and carried in it the particular careful tone of someone who is about to deliver information they know will cause damage. She told Rosevelt that their team had been unable to verify the marriage certificate through the state records system, that the registration number on the document returned no matching record, that the officiant listed, Raymond Osei, did not appear in the state's database of licensed officiants for the date listed on the certificate, and that as a result, the legal team needed to flag a question. Was Rosevelt Calloway legally married? Rosevelt thanked Sandra Obi. She said she would look into it. She set down the phone, and then she sat completely still at her desk for 11 minutes, which she knows because she watched the clock on her computer screen without blinking, in the particular suspended animation state that the human mind sometimes enters when it is processing something it does not yet have language for. Then she got to work, because Rosevelt Calloway, when confronted with a problem, has always gotten to work. She spent the next 4 hours conducting the most methodical, thorough, and ultimately devastating self-investigation of her own marriage that you can imagine. She called the state records office. She pulled the registration number herself. She searched the officiant database. She found Raymond Osei, not as a licensed officiant, but as the subject of a complaint filed 3 years before her wedding, in which a different couple had alleged he had performed their ceremony without a valid license, and that their marriage had subsequently been found to have no legal standing. She found that Raymond Osei had died 14 months after her wedding. She found that Lukas Calloway had known Raymond Osei personally, had grown up 2 streets from his family, had attended the same church as a child. She found a paper trail of small, interlocking facts that arranged themselves, one by one, into a picture so clear and so terrible that she had to close her laptop and leave the building and walk 6 blocks in the cold before she could breathe normally again. The marriage had never been real. The certificate was a forgery. Raymond Osei had not made an administrative error. He had done what Lukas had asked him to do. And Lukas Calloway, the man she had loved since she was 15 years old, the man whose family had given her the first experience of belonging she had ever had, the man whose name she had taken, the man she had worked alongside and argued with and forgiven and built a life next to for 7 years, had known, from the moment she walked down that aisle, that the document she believed in so completely was worth nothing at all. She came home that night, and she cooked dinner. This is one of the details about Rosevelt Calloway that tells you everything you need to know about her. She came home knowing what she knew, and she made pasta, and she set the table, and she waited for Lukas to come through the door. Not because she was weak, not because she was in denial, but because she was gathering herself. She was doing what she had always done in the moments that mattered most, taking the full weight of a terrible thing, measuring it carefully, and deciding, with absolute deliberateness, how she was going to move. She was not going to react. She was going to respond. There is a difference. One is instinct. The other is architecture. Lukas came home at 7:15. He kissed her on the cheek. He took off his jacket. He sat down at the table where she had already placed 2 plates and poured 2 glasses of water. And for maybe 10 minutes they had what looked, from the outside, like a completely ordinary Tuesday night dinner. And then Rosevelt set down her fork, and she told him, in a voice that was quieter than the room, what she had found. What happened next is something she has described in the years since only in pieces, because pieces are all she can offer without the whole thing becoming unmanageable. He did not deny it immediately. That was the first shock. She had expected some version of outrage, some performance of disbelief, the kind of thing that people sometimes do when they're caught in a lie, and their instinct is to make you feel crazy for believing what you can plainly see. He did not do that. What he did instead was what she later came to understand as the final, most revealing tale of who he was. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the table, and in a voice so flat it barely qualified as a voice, he said, "I was going to tell you. I was always going to tell you. I just didn't know when." 7 years. He had been going to tell her for 7 years. She had built her life, her firm, her identity as a wife and a partner, and a person who finally belonged to something permanent. She had built all of it on a foundation she had never been allowed to inspect. And he had been going to tell her. He had been going to get around to it. When the time was right. When he had figured out how to explain it. Rosevelt told him, with the same quiet voice she had used all evening. And this is the sentence she uses when she tells this story. The one that lands differently every time she says it. She told him, "You had 7 years to find the right time. You chose every single one of them to stay silent. That is not a delay. That is a decision." She asked him to leave. She did not cry. Not in front of him. She walked him to the door with the same steadiness she brought to every structural problem she had ever been asked to solve. And she closed it behind him, and she stood with her back against it for a very long time. And then she went to the living room. And she took the framed certificate off the wall. And she held it in both hands for a moment and looked at it. 7 years of believing this piece of paper was the most concrete evidence that she existed, that she was loved, that she was someone's. And it was paper. It was always only paper. She placed it face down on the coffee table. She turned off the light. And she went to bed, because there was a full day of work tomorrow, and Rosevelt Calloway had never in her life allowed grief to stop the clock. She filed for what would have been divorce proceedings, even knowing there was legally nothing to dissolve, partly for the formal record, and partly because she needed the act of it, the deliberate, documented, witnessed act of ending something. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt who had represented her on several commercial contracts, and who received the full account of what had happened with an expression of quiet fury that Rosevelt found oddly comforting, told her that while there was no marriage to legally dissolve, there were potential grounds for a civil claim based on fraudulent misrepresentation, given the shared property, the shared financial decisions, and the years of documented conduct that had induced Rosevelt to act as a married woman to her material detriment. Rosevelt listened carefully, and then she said, "I don't want his money, Patricia. I want documentation that I was deceived. I want a record that says this happened, that it was real, and that I survived it." And Patricia Holt looked at her client across the desk and said, "Then that is what we are going to get you." It was during the process of gathering that documentation, of working with Patricia Holt's office to assemble the paper trail of 7 years, that the second earthquake arrived. And I want to be very clear about the timing here, because the timing is not incidental. It is not a coincidence that these events happened within the same week. Or rather, it is a coincidence in the literal sense, in that no single person orchestrated both revelations simultaneously. But in the deeper sense, in the sense of how the world sometimes works, in the particular way that things held back for a long time tend to surface all at once when a dam begins to crack. In that sense, the timing makes a kind of terrible, perfect sense. Patricia Holt's office had been contacting various institutions to establish the timeline of the fraudulent marriage, and in the course of that process, a letter had arrived at Roosevelt's address. Not a legal document. A personal letter. Hand-delivered. Sealed. Her name on the front and handwriting she did not recognize, though she would later come to understand that she had seen it before on a single piece of paper that had accompanied her into Sycamore House at the age of 13, a note attached to her intake file that the staff had told her contained nothing of significance and that she had never been allowed to read in full. The letter was from an attorney named Howard Greenfield, representing the estate of a man named Clifton Hale. Clifton Hale. The name meant nothing to her at first. Then it meant everything. Clifton Hale was the founder and majority owner of Hale Development Group, a real estate and infrastructure conglomerate that operated across 6 states and that was, by the most recent published valuation, worth somewhere in the region of $1.4 billion. He had died 11 months earlier, at the age of 69, after a private battle with a degenerative illness that he had kept out of the press with the same combination of discipline and resources that had characterized everything else in his life. He was survived by 2 adult children from his first marriage, who together held minority stakes in the company, and by the terms of a will that he had executed and re-executed and amended and re-amended over the course of the last 8 years of his life, a will that named, as his primary heir and the intended recipient of his controlling interest in Hale Development Group, a woman he described as his daughter. A daughter he had never publicly acknowledged. A daughter he had placed in foster care when she was 18 months old, after the death of her mother, with a note that said her name was Rosevelt, and that he intended to come back for her, and that he was sorry, and that he never stopped being sorry, not for a single day. Howard Greenfield's letter asked Rosevelt if she would be willing to submit to a DNA verification process to establish her identity as Clifton Hale's daughter, as a precondition to the administration of his estate. The letter noted that a preliminary genetic comparison had already been conducted on the basis of material that Rosevelt had unknowingly provided, and that the result was consistent with the claimed biological relationship. It noted that the estate had been in a holding pattern for 11 months while Greenfield's office located her. It noted, in the careful language of a legal document that was also, somehow, a message from a dead man to his living daughter, that Clifton Hale had followed her career from a distance for years, that he had read about her firm winning the city contract, that he had kept a file, that the file was very thick. Rosevelt read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the same manila folder where she was keeping the documents related to the fraudulent marriage. And then she did something that she has said she is still not entirely sure she can explain. She went to the spare room where she kept her old sketchbooks, the ones from college, the ones from before, the ones going all the way back to the notebooks from Sycamore House with the library borrowed books pressed between the pages, and she pulled out the oldest one she had. And she found the page where, at the age of 15, she had sketched the floor plan of the house she wanted to live in one day. The house she had drawn from imagination and want and pure stubborn hope. And she sat with it for a long time. And she thought about a man who had kept a file, who had followed her career from a distance, who had watched her build something and had never once knocked on the door to say, "I see you. I made you. I am proud of you. And I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." The DNA test confirmed what Howard Greenfield's office had already determined through preliminary analysis. Rosevelt Calloway was, beyond any legal or biological doubt, the daughter of Clifton Hale, the sole heir to his controlling stake in Hale Development Group. The person who, by the terms of a will that had been amended 8 times in 8 years, each amendment moving more of the estate in her direction, as if Clifton Hale had spent the last decade of his life trying, on paper, to compensate for everything he had failed to do in person. The person who now controlled the future of a company that employed over 4,000 people across 6 states and whose asset portfolio included commercial developments, public infrastructure contracts, and a residential division that had built more affordable housing units in the Mid-Atlantic region than any comparable private firm in the previous decade. The news broke before Rosevelt was ready for it to break, because news of this kind always does. A clerk in Howard Greenfield's office talked to someone, who told someone else, and within 72 hours of the DNA results being formally certified, there were reporters outside the offices of her architecture firm. There were headlines. There were think pieces. There were people who had gone to school with her reaching out through social media to say they had always known she was special, which is the kind of thing that people say when they want proximity to something significant without having done anything to earn it. The story was irresistible in the way that certain stories are irresistible: the orphan daughter, the secret inheritance, the billionaire father who watched from a distance. It had every element that makes people lean forward and reach for their phones. What the headlines could not fully capture, and what I want to try to give you here, is what this felt like from the inside. Because Rosevelt has talked about this, in the careful, measured way she talks about everything. And she has said that the thing she was least prepared for was not the scale of the inheritance or the complexity of suddenly being responsible for $1 billion company. It was the grief. She had expected shock. She had expected the logistical overwhelm of lawyers and financial advisors and board members and press inquiries and the entire apparatus that surrounds the transfer of significant wealth. She had not expected to grieve. But grief is what arrived. Grief for the father she never had. Grief for the version of her childhood that could have existed, that should have existed, if Clifton Hale had been a braver man or a better man, or simply a man who understood what it cost a child to grow up without the person who was supposed to come back for her. She did not hate him. That surprised her too. She had imagined, in the abstract, that if she ever found out who her father was and that he had chosen not to be in her life, she would feel rage. But rage requires a certain energy, a certain upward motion, and what Rosevelt felt was more like the specific exhaustion that comes from finally being able to put down something very heavy that you have been carrying for a very long time. She met with Howard Greenfield and the board of Hale Development Group in a formal session 3 weeks after the DNA confirmation. She walked into that conference room, a long glass-walled space on the 43rd floor of a downtown office building, with a view of a skyline that she had, in one form or another, been designing toward her entire life. And she sat at the head of the table, which was where Howard Greenfield quietly and deliberately placed her chair, and she listened to 2 hours of briefings about the company's structure, its obligations, its ongoing projects, its financial position, and the terms of the transition of control. She asked precise questions. She took detailed notes. She did not perform confidence for the room, which is something that people who are genuinely confident rarely need to do. At the end of the meeting, the company's chief operating officer, a man named Douglas Price who had worked for Clifton Hale for 22 years and whose initial skepticism of this orphan daughter narrative had been visible in every line of his face when she walked through the door, said to her, quietly, as the room was clearing, "He would have liked how you handled this." Rosevelt thanked him. And then she went home and cooked pasta again, because it was Tuesday, and some structures hold even when everything around them is changing. Lukas heard the news the same way everyone else did, through a headline. He sent her a text message that said, "Rose, I know I don't deserve any part of this, but I just need you to know I always knew you were going to be something." She did not respond. Patricia Holt's office was handling all necessary communications with Lukas Calloway at this point, and Rosevelt had made a deliberate decision to direct her emotional energy away from him and toward the future, which she had learned, at some significant personal cost, was the only direction in which it was useful to point. Adrian Mercer entered this story the way most truly significant things entered Roosevelt's life, without announcement, without ceremony, and at a moment when she was not remotely looking for him. He was 42 years old, the founder and chief executive of Mercer Global Infrastructure, an international investment and development firm headquartered in London with active operations on 4 continents. He had built it from a single commercial real estate fund in his late 20s, making a series of investments that had looked, at the time, like calculated risks and that had since been studied in business school case studies as examples of insight, so precise it bordered on the prophetic. He was known, in the particular way that people at the highest levels of industry are known, not for loud or public gestures, but for the quality of his judgment. People said about Adrian Mercer that he was the best reader of long-term value in his industry, that he could walk into a space, a building, a company, a conversation, and understand almost immediately what it was worth and what it would be worth, that he was almost never wrong. He had been following the coverage of Hale Development Group's transition of control with the attention of someone who was interested, professionally, in the direction the company was going to take under new leadership. The company's asset portfolio overlapped with several infrastructure corridors that Mercer Global had been evaluating for potential investment. A meeting between the two organizations was a natural and logical next step, and Howard Greenfield's office had been in communication with Mercer Global's representative for several weeks when Adrian Mercer decided, without explanation and without precedent in his usual practice, to attend the initial exploratory conversation in person rather than sending a deputy. His team noted this departure from his standard operating procedure and said nothing, because teams that work for people of Adrian Mercer's caliber learn relatively quickly which decisions to question and which to simply accommodate. He arrived on a Thursday. He was on time to the minute, which his assistant had noted was not remarkable because he was always exactly on time, never early, never late, as if he had a private agreement with the clock that other people were not privy to. He came with 2 advisors and a folder of materials he had clearly read in full and annotated in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like architectural notation. Rosevelt had been briefed on Mercer Global, on Adrian Mercer's background, on the substance of what the meeting was intended to cover. She had not been briefed on what it would feel like to be in the same room as someone whose intelligence operated at the same register as her own, not above it, not below it, at exactly the same frequency, for the first time and longer than she could clearly remember. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It was supposed to last 90 minutes. The agenda was covered in the first hour, and what followed was not small talk. Neither of them were people who spent time on small talk, but something more like a sustained examination of ideas. He asked her about her design philosophy, and she told him, in more detail than she had ever told a boardroom, about the belief that had driven every project she had ever taken on, that the purpose of built space is to make the people inside it feel that they belong there. That the most important question an architect can ask is not how does this look, but how does this feel to the person standing in it who has never had anything built for them before. He listened to this with the absolute attention of someone who is not simply waiting for his turn to speak. And then he said, "My company has been trying to articulate that principle for years. We have never said it that clearly." They talked about the Hale Development Group's affordable housing division, which Rosevelt had already identified as the part of the company she intended to prioritize. He told her about a parallel initiative that Mercer Global had been piloting in 3 European cities, with results that were promising but that had hit structural obstacles he was still working to resolve. She identified the obstacles accurately, within about 4 minutes of him describing them, and suggested an approach that was different from everything his team had tried, and that he recognized immediately as probably correct. He wrote it down, in that very small handwriting, and she watched him write it down and felt something shift slightly in the air between them, the way it does sometimes when 2 people have been circling the same idea from different directions and finally arrive at the same point at the same moment. He asked her, before the meeting ended and while his advisors were gathering their materials, if she would be willing to continue the conversation over dinner. Not as a business meeting. He was precise about that. Not as a business meeting. As a conversation between 2 people who, he said, appeared to be working on the same problem from different angles, and who might find the informal setting more productive than the conference table. Rosevelt looked at him for a moment. She was aware, in a distant and untroubling way, that she was being asked out to dinner by a man she had known for 3 hours, and that 3 months ago, she had been confronting her not-husband about a forged marriage certificate, and that the last several weeks had involved more seismic personal upheaval than most people experience in a decade. She was aware that the reasonable response was to decline, or to at minimum suggest a delay. She said yes, not because she was swept away, not because she had stopped thinking clearly, but because Rosevelt Calloway had spent her entire life making decisions based on careful, realistic assessments of what was worth pursuing and what was not. And her assessment in that moment, sitting at the head of a conference table on the 43rd floor with the skyline behind her and a folder of annotated materials in front of her, and a man across the table who had just written down her idea in very small handwriting without commentary or qualification, was that this was worth pursuing. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, it was worth the risk of it. And she had always, even when the risk looked enormous, been willing to build toward things she could not yet see the end of. They had dinner that Thursday, and the following Thursday, and a series of Thursdays and Tuesdays and occasional Sunday mornings after that, the rhythm of it establishing itself without either of them formally agreeing to establish it, which is the way things sometimes go between people who are both accustomed to being in control of everything and find themselves, in this one particular situation, willing to set that control down. Adrian Mercer was, she discovered, a man who had constructed his professional life with extraordinary precision and his personal life with almost none at all. He had been in one serious relationship in his 30s that had ended because he had spent too much time in airports and not enough time in any single city. He was honest about this in a way that she found both refreshing and slightly alarming. The way he could catalog his own failures with the same dispassionate accuracy he brought to analyzing a balance sheet. She told him once that it was unusual, the way he talked about himself. He said, "I find that being accurate about what went wrong is the fastest way to make sure it doesn't go wrong again." She said, "That is the most architectural thing anyone has ever said to me." And he laughed. And it was a genuinely good laugh, the kind that comes from the whole chest. She told him about the fraudulent marriage. Not immediately, but earlier than she had told anyone outside of Patricia Holt's office and her closest friend, a woman named Denise Carver, who had been her college roommate, and who had reacted to the news with a controlled fury that had, if anything, made Rosevelt feel slightly guilty on Lukas's behalf. She told Adrian over dinner on a rainy Wednesday evening, with the flat precision she used for all difficult things, beginning at the beginning and going through to the end without dramatic pause or editorializing. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, I am going to believe you." He said, "Is there any part of you that still loves him?" And she thought about it. Not quickly. She took her time with the question the way she took her time with all structural questions. And she said, "I love the 15-year-old who decided I was worth noticing in a biology class. That person was real. The person he became. The person who looked me in the eye every day for 7 years knowing what he knew. I don't think I ever really knew that person. You can't love someone you never actually met." Adrian proposed 8 months later, on a Thursday, because by then Thursday was theirs in the particular way that days become yours when you have spent enough of them in the company of someone who makes them better. He did not get down on one knee in a parking lot. He did not handle all the paperwork and tell her to just show up and trust him. He sat across from her at the kitchen table in her apartment, the same table where she had once cooked pasta and waited for Lukas to come home so she could tell him what she knew. And he placed a ring on the table between them, and he said, "I want to be very clear about what I am asking you. I am asking if you would be willing to build something with me. Not a performance of something, not a picture of something, an actual thing, with a real foundation, that we design together, that we can both inspect whenever we want, that holds the weight of both of us without pretending it doesn't cost anything to build. I have the license. I have the officiant. I have filed the paperwork. Everything is documented and verifiable and real. Because you deserve for it to be real. You have always deserved for it to be real." She picked up the ring. She held it in her palm. And she thought about the girl who had arrived at Sycamore House at 13 with one bag and a library book she was 2 weeks overdue on, who had drawn floor plans in the margins of her notebooks, who had spent her entire life building things for other people to belong inside of while belonging to nothing herself. She thought about the framed certificate she had taken off the wall and placed face down on the coffee table. She thought about the file Clifton Hale had kept for years, the thick file, full of her work, full of evidence that someone had been watching, even if watching from a distance was the best he could manage. She thought about Chester the golden retriever, who was currently asleep on the floor next to the table with his enormous head resting on Adrian's shoe, which she considered a strong endorsement. And then she said yes. She said yes with both hands. She said yes with every part of herself that had spent 42 years building towards something permanent, something real, something that could be inspected and found solid all the way down. The wedding was handled by both of them, together, every document verified at every step. Their attorney was present for the filing. Patricia Holt attended as a guest and cried, which she claimed afterward was the result of seasonal allergies, which fooled no one. Howard Greenfield attended on behalf of the estate of Clifton Hale because Rosevelt had decided that her father's lawyer was the closest thing she had to a representative of her father's wishes, and she wanted someone there who could carry word of what had happened back to whatever version of accounting existed on the other side of things. Sister Delphine from Sycamore House, retired now, nearly 80, with the same upright posture and level gaze she had carried through 35 years of working with children the system had tried to forget, sat in the front row and said nothing during the ceremony and everything with her eyes. Denise Carver was maid of honor and spent most of the reception crying in the best possible way and telling everyone within earshot that she had always known. Rosevelt Mercer, she kept Calloway professionally, added Mercer personally, and holds both with equal ease, has been the managing principal of Hale Development Group for 3 years now. Under her leadership, the company's affordable housing division has tripled in output. The residential design philosophy she brought from her architecture practice has been integrated into the company's development model in ways that Douglas Price, who is still the chief operating officer and who has quietly become one of her most loyal advocates, has described in industry interviews as genuinely transformational. The partnership with Mercer Global Infrastructure, professional as well as personal, has resulted in 3 completed projects across 2 continents and a pipeline that her team refers to, affectionately and accurately, as the most ambitious thing any of them have ever worked on. Her architecture firm still operates. She kept it deliberately small, kept it focused on exactly the kind of work that made it what it is, the projects that other firms pass on, the buildings designed for the people who have never had anything built for them before. She still takes personal projects. She still sketches in notebooks. The margins are still full of buildings. Lukas Calloway left the city. He moved to a smaller town several hours away and by all accounts has built a quieter life there. The civil proceedings were settled without a trial. There was no criminal prosecution. The forgery, while deliberate and well-documented, fell into a legal gray area that Patricia Holt pursued with vigor and ultimately resolved through a civil remedy that Rosevelt used, in its entirety, to endow a scholarship fund for young women aging out of foster care who want to study architecture or engineering or design. The fund is named for Mrs. Patrice Dunbar, the school librarian who first told her that her talent was real. Mrs. Dunbar attended the announcement of the fund and stood at the podium and said, in a voice that carried all the way to the back of the room without a microphone, "I always knew." And the room believed her, because she said it with the particular certainty of someone who has been waiting a long time to be right about something important. Rosevelt has said, in interviews and in the quieter conversations that happen after interviews, when the recorder is off and the journalist is just a person, that the thing she most wants people to understand about her story is this: the lie did not make her. She had already made herself before Lukas Calloway decided, at 22 years old, that she was something he could deceive because she had no one to protect her. She had already made herself, quietly and methodically and without permission or assistance, out of library books and margin sketches and the stubborn refusal to accept that the world's early verdict on her value was final. The lie did not make her, but surviving it, and then discovering what came after it, and then choosing, not by default, not out of desperation, but out of clear-eyed, deliberate, fully informed desire, to build something new on ground she had first inspected herself, all the way down to the foundation. That is what she is most proud of. She lives in a house she designed. She and Adrian designed it together, the way they design everything, with all the documents in order, all the calculations verified, all the decisions made in the full knowledge of what they are choosing and what it will cost and what it will hold. Chester the Golden Retriever has been joined by a second dog, a small and opinionated terrier named Archie, who has destroyed 4 pairs of shoes and shown no signs of reform. Her office has a window that looks out at the skyline she has been designing towards since she was a 15-year-old girl sketching floor plans in a biology notebook. On the wall of that office, there is one framed document, not a marriage certificate, a land survey. The property record for the first building she ever designed that was built for low-income families on the east side of the city, a project she took on for almost nothing, years before anyone knew her name, because someone had to build it and it mattered that it was built well. Her name is in the corner of that survey. Her handwriting, her work, real and registered and permanent and hers. That is the story of Rosevelt Calloway Mercer. That is what it looks like when someone who was given nothing decides to build everything anyway. And now that you know it, I want to ask you one more time to hit that subscribe button if you have not already, because we have more stories coming, stories about people who refused to be defined by what was done to them, who chose, against every reasonable expectation, to keep building. You do not want to miss what is next. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the structures in your own life, about the foundations you are standing on and whether they are solid, drop it in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what this story meant to you. Because the whole reason we tell these stories is so that the people living them know that someone is listening. And you are always, in this space, someone who is heard.